I'd like to take some time to speak to the principles of Parashara and Jaimini astrology. There's a controversy around these two systems, and the main idea is that they should not be practiced together. That you should not take pieces of one system and use it when you are analyzing a chart with the other system. And in my experience exploring these astrological teachings, that they're not separate, they're not meant to be practiced separately. I'm going to describe my reasons here so that you can consider it for yourself. And that's really where you're going to come to the best analysis and understanding, is by thinking it through, considering it for yourself. And one of the difficulties is a bit of a fundamentalist approach that people have to astrology, which makes sense because for thousands of years, astrology has been linked to and related to religious practices, especially when it comes to the idea of Vedic astrology or Indian astrology. So it's going to be hard to remove some of those sentiments. But it is fascinating because when you discuss astrology with someone who has a more fundamental approach, meaning they'll say things like, don't practice Jaimini techniques with Parashara techniques because they're not meant to be mixed. That's the way the sages said it. They're okay accepting that kind of approach. But if I mention something like how, as I was growing up, I questioned my religious thoughts and views of my family, they'll say, well, that's okay. You know, that's good to question those things, to explore those things. So keep in mind that as we're thinking about astrology, we want to make sure that we're not getting into a mindset where we're saying it's okay to question and think one aspect of life and belief systems and philosophies and principles through, but it's not okay to question these things. It can end up being kind of a hypocritical approach. But anyway, back to this idea of Jaimini and Parashara. First of all, if we think about it logically, why might it be so that Jaimini astrology and Parashara astrology, why is it okay to practice them together? Well, if we use a metaphor, let's think about sciences. Let's think about chemistry and physics. Chemistry and physics are two distinct disciplines of a natural science. However, if you want to launch a rocket, if you want to build a gasoline combustion engine, you have to have knowledge of both physics and chemistry to make that work. So sciences can overlap, and that's going to be the case, all across the board. Sciences can overlap to accomplish a greater goal, a greater good. And the same thing can be true of Jaimini and Parashara astrology. Parashara's astrology, we can think of that as being more lunar-based. Why is that? Because when we think of Parashara astrology, oftentimes the timing of events and situations are based on the nakshatra dashas, which are indicative of that zodiac, the lunar zodiac, specific to the moon and the movement of the moon. And the nakshatra dashas themselves are created based on where is the moon at the moment of a person's birth. That's what starts the timing of all the karmas expressing in Parashara astrology. If we think of Jaimini astrology, this is more Rashi-based or sign-based astrology, which is related more to the sun. And when we think of the sun in Jaimini and Rashi-based astrology, that's going to be more specific to concrete experiences of life manifesting in this world. What do you get? What comes into your life? What is taken away from you? Whereas in Parashara astrology, yes, we will be able to see that and do that. But Parashara astrology is more so related to how do you feel about the things that you get? How do you psychologically act with the things that you get? And that in and of itself can control and distinguish what occurs within your life. Because the way you direct your mind and your consciousness, the way you direct your ego, your jiva, your soul, the moon, that often has a profound impact on what you experience. But Jaimini, its relationship to the Rashis and the signs. That's why the Charanavamsha dasha, any of the Jaimini Rashi-based dashas are really about what's coming into your life and what's going out of your life. And then when you tie that together with Parashara astrology, that's going to show how are you going to work with that, how are you going to deal with it, how are you going to appreciate it, how are you going to perceive it through the aspect of the moon, the jiva, the soul, the mental, emotional, astral body. Now, with these two things being linked together, we need to be aware that in Parashara's text, Brihat Parashara Horashastra, there's a chapter where you will find principles of Jaimini astrology. You'll find the principles there, indicating that these two systems do have references to each other, do have benefits by interweaving them together. Now, we have to remember the point that some of you are probably thinking, that over many, many years, Parashara's text has been recompiled. And so many people say that there will be questions about how accurate certain phrases might be, or maybe there will be aspects added in that don't necessarily belong there. And it's even been surmised that there are chapters that are missing from Parashara. And that's understandable, because we're human and we're living in a human world where people take information, recompile information, and it's easy to fall back on a religious pseudo-spiritual approach where you say, well, this is the divine word of some holy individual, and therefore somehow it may just happen to survive exactly intact through thousands of years. But the more realistic you pay attention to humanity, even today, when you read a book that's printed on the modern press, when you read a book that's been edited by 10 or 20 highly trained people to look for errors, you still find errors in the book. So to think that over the past 2,000-3,000 years, when there wasn't a printing press, when there was no technology, when the human intellect was not anywhere near where it is now when it comes to nitpicking things, to think that somehow that perfection survived through all those centuries, that's a little bit unrealistic. But anyway, back to the point. So you can say that, number one, we have Jaimini principles in Parashara's text. Talks about Argala, talks about the Svamsha or the Karakamsha, talks about the Charkarakas and so on. And you could say, like I say, that that shows that there is an overlap between these two systems. Or you could take the other approach, which is going to say that, well, this was probably added in later, or this is probably not meant to be there. So we have to think these things through, and you have to come to your own conclusion. However, when I think about these two systems, I think about them in the same way that you consider a mathematical equation or a mathematical formula. You can do addition and subtraction by itself, or if you studied mathematics at all, even high school mathematics, in your physics classes and chemistry classes, you learn that you can make equations that say, all right, here, in these little parentheses, do addition, then divide it by this, then add it to this, then subtract this, then multiply that. There's a way of putting together a formula that says, do this, then that, then this, then that, and you get your final result. The same thing can be true with Jaimini and Parashara astrology, because whereas addition does one thing and subtraction does another, and multiplication does one thing and division does another, that they can be utilized together to get a final result. So the same is true with Jaimini and Parashara astrology. The Jaimini system can focus on the concrete experiences, and this is primarily inspired by a recent interview that Kapil Raj and a good friend of mine, Corey Dowds, also an astrologer, did, and he got into this. And I've thought about this before. I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to do a video on this. But you can look at Jaimini astrology, and it will tell you, as Corey mentioned in the video with Kapil, what kind of house do you live in? When you look at the Darakarka and you look at the sign that the Darakarka is in the Navamsha or even in the Rashi chart, how does the spouse or wife or partner grow into your life based on the sign that it's in? What are the qualities that that person has? When you find the Karakamsha or the Atmakarka and the Navamsha, that can tell you what kind of work or job or path does a person actually get involved with. Meaning, what is the nature of it? Are they working in governments and corporations? Are they working as a teacher? When we get Moon and Venus combinations on the Karakamsha. Are they a writer, Jupiter and Moon combinations? Are they involved in logistics, a Martian combination or Mars combination? So you can see these things through Jaimini's principles. But then when you want to look at how's the person relating to their spouse, how's the person relating to their career, their path, well, then you would look at Parashara Astrology and the Nakshatra Dashas. And these two things can be separate things. In the same way, this is where we have a little bit of a too simplistic approach to astrology, because someone comes to an astrologer and says, tell me about this time period, this point in my life. And they're expecting the astrologer to say, you will have a great career, done. Or your relationships will go fantastic, done. And that's not what's happening, because as you know, if you just pay attention to people's lives, all kinds of things go on at the exact same time. Someone might get a promotion. At the exact same time, their mother may die. They may also be pregnant and have the best baby in the world. They might get their car stolen. All this stuff can happen within the exact same time period. So there's a lot happening at once. And it may be that you get a promotion, possibly indicated by a Jaimini principle, development within career, looking at one of the Rashi Dashas. But then you're in a Parashara Nakshatra Dasha where you're miserable. You feel like you're working too hard, you're underappreciated. You got the promotion, but you don't appreciate it. Because one is looking at the mental, emotional, what I might call the more astral experience that a person is having, the Parashara Astrology. The other is looking at the actual physical, concrete thing of what happened, what came into your life. And when things come into your life, how you feel about them will be different based on the time of day, the time of month, the time of year, and so on. So when we're looking at these two systems, we see that they are meant to be practiced together. In the same way, and before I get to this point I wanted to touch upon, I was going to mention aspects and the different kinds of aspects, but we'll save that to a little bit later on in this talk. So let's back up. We mentioned that in Brihat Parashara Horashastra, there is reference to Jaimini principles. There's a whole chapter on it. There's several little sections. And again, we can assume that that means that these two systems have parts that are meant to be utilized in the same way that you have different sets of an equation. Or you can go with a very common thought that, oh, well, that was just added, it doesn't belong there. And I don't know how we can prove that yet. So far, no one's really given me any kind of definite advice other than they just say something like that. So either way, we don't necessarily know for sure. But if we look at Jaimini Sutras, and this is Ernst Wilhelm's commentary on the sutras. I can't really see it that well. Oh, there you go. Jaimini Sutras Raw, Volume 1, a literal translation of the first chapter of Jaimini's Upadesha Sutras by Ernst Wilhelm. If we look at section 1.135, Jaimini has gone through the numerical naming of Rashis and Bhavas, talked about Padas, talked about Dasha links, the natural Karakas, the Chara Karakas, all very important things. Talked about Argala, which is a wonderful principle that you can use in Parashara Astrology as well, and we'll discuss this here in just a moment. But Jaimini has already gone through a lot of principles up until he gets to 1.135, that particular verse. And once he gets to this verse, which comes before the self-division of the grahas, and also the reference to the svamsha, it comes before that. He says, and please excuse my pronunciation here, Horadaya Siddha. And if we're going to consider this in a literal translation, Hora indicates Varga, horoscopy, an hour, refers to time, Adaya, etc., beginning with. Siddha, accomplished, perfected, thoroughly skilled or versed in, admitted to be true or right. And the way Ernst translates this, authoritative horoscopy, etc., skilled in Hora, Varga, etc., skilled in hours, etc. And again, you have to have some insights into how to read Sanskrit in order to make sense of this. But he goes on to say, with this sutra, Jaimini refers us to other authoritative texts, and teachers for the Varga calculations and other commonly known aspects of astrology not covered in this text. In respect to making any predictions, Vargas are key. The effects of Kala, time, also crudely known as Hora, are also important. In essence, Jaimini lets us know that he has completed a list of principles required for his techniques, and that for other principles, we are to follow that given in standard texts, the best of which is Brihat Parashara Shastra. So we see here that in Jaimini doesn't say, just follow these principles, that's it. That's all you need are my principles. All you need is my system. All you need is my philosophy, and you've got it down. Towards the very beginning of the whole sutras, the Jaimini Upadesha Sutras, he says, I'm describing my principles to you, but the things that are not in here refer to other authoritative texts and teachers. So we see that Jaimini itself, that whole system is not saying, I am separate from everything. It is saying, this is one more limb or branch or aspect of the tree, or one more segment of the equation. All right, so we have to bear this in mind. And that just makes sense. In the same way that when we were thinking about the idea of Argala, well, Argala, I have found, is a wonderful principle to consider. I've done a video on Argala on this channel already, so you might need to scroll back through previous videos to find it. But Argala is a principle that can show you what is pinned to your destiny for good or for ill. What is pinned to your destiny for good or for ill. The things that you're not necessarily going to be able to escape from, again, for good or for ill. There is a principle in Argala that there can be blocks to that Argala. So you can have a positive Argala, success with finances, wealth, whatever it might be, success in any endeavor, depending on what the planets are telling you it is. And then there's a principle that can show you, is that Argala, is that getting blocked? Are you getting sidetracked from it? And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. Maybe you got a good Argala that's being derailed by another part of the chart. Maybe you've got a bad Argala that's getting derailed by a positive aspect of your chart. And what I found is that by just using a simple principle of Jaimini, Argala, you can look at it also using not just the Rashi-based dashas, but also looking at the Vimshatari Nakshatra dasha. Because when you run a period where the planets causing Argala are activated by Nakshatra dasha, well, of course you're going to pay attention to those planets, and that Argala is also going to be felt. And what you'll find is that if you are able to use both systems to overlap them, then what you'll find is that when there is confluence, when Jaimini says one thing is happening by a Rashi dasha, and the Nakshatra dasha, Parashara's dasha system, says it's happening as well, or it's supported, or planets supportive of that are getting activated, then you have a much bigger event occurring in a person's life. Again, for good or for ill, it depends on what it means. And of course, you have to be able to read the chart itself before you can understand that. So when you're thinking about Jaimini, when you're thinking about Parashara, it's up to you to decide whether you think it's meant to be separate or not. It's up to you to decide whether you're going to judge something to be a later addition or a corruption to something. Because everyone has their ideas about this. But it won't hurt you to test these things out. It won't hurt you to consider Jaimini principles when you are also considering Parashara principles. And this brings me to the idea, and we'll conclude here, the idea of Rashi aspects, which are considered to be a Jaimini-based principle. Although they are mentioned, at least unless I'm misremembering, they are mentioned in Parashara Shastra. So there's Rashi aspects, which are aspects between signs. Aspects between signs, like any planet in Aries is going to Rashi aspect any planet in Leo, Scorpio, and so on. So the active sign aspects the fixed signs, and the fixed signs aspect the active signs, and the mutable or changeable, not changeable, the mutable signs, the dual signs, they aspect each other. So there are those kinds of aspects that are Rashi or sign-based aspects. And then we have Graha aspects. And those are the things that most people just write off and say Mars aspects 1, 4, 7, Mars aspects 4, 7, and 8 from wherever it's placed. And they just leave it at that. But they never have gone back to Parashara to see that is not based on houses, that is based on degrees. So if you look at Brihat Parashara Horashastra, you'll see that the degree of exactly what you might consider to be the exact cusp, like if Mars is at 2 degrees of Aries, and whatever is exactly at 2 degrees of Scorpio, it's that degree, that pattern, which makes it a full-on aspect. It's not that it's in the 8th house, it's that it's the degrees away from it. And this is covered in Brihat Parashara Horashastra. But those are planetary aspects. Those are between planets. So Rashi aspects, considered to be traditionally a Jaimini principle, are between signs. Planetary aspects are between planets or points. And then we can also look at Tajika aspects. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because in the apprenticeship program, as I was going through the feedback for the year, planning for the beginning of the next influx of students for the coming year, I asked the question, who would you advise this program for and who would you say to stay away from it? And one of the things that one of the students said was, I would advise non-traditional people who have a little more open mind and are not locked into more fundamentalist traditional approach to things. I would not advise them to take this course. And I thought to myself, well, why is that? I mean, I'm teaching the course specifically from Brihat Parashara Horashastra, Satya Jatakam, Brihat Jataka, all these traditional texts, and I'm following what they're saying. But one of the things he mentioned, he said that, number one, I do reference Jaimini as being useful, and traditionally you want to keep them separate. Traditionally, I didn't say it was right, I just said traditionally. And remember, just because something's tradition doesn't mean it's accurate. It reminds me of a funny little meme I saw where it was talking about people who are extremely homophobic, that they should do a reality TV show where they're forced to live for a year 100% by traditional biblical law and see how much they enjoy that. So we have to remember that just because something's tradition doesn't necessarily mean it's right or appropriate to our current culture. We are always evolving as a species, as a race, as an intelligence, and we can see that in the sciences and so on. But anyway, that's what he said. And he said, and you also have specific ways of looking at the aspects. Because I use the Jaimini, traditionally Jaimini Rashi aspects, as well as the Parashara planetary aspects, and also the Tajika aspects. They all do something different. And it makes perfect sense, because it doesn't make sense for astrology to be redundant. It doesn't make sense for it to be redundant at all. They have to be doing different things, which means if they're doing different things, then they're filling in another piece of the puzzle, another piece of the activity. So the Rashi aspects, they show how strong a sign is, which is what? The field in which a planet grows and thrives and flourishes. The stronger that field, that's like taking you and putting you in a palatial mansion. You're going to feel much more comfortable. You're going to be able to be more relaxed, get more things done. So those are what Rashi aspects can do. In the same way that when we think of planetary aspects, that's not the environment that you are in. That's not the palatial mansion. The planetary aspects are who's in that mansion with you. Do you have friends there that are saying, oh, you want to record a CD, so I happen to be a musical engineer and this happens to be a bass player and a drummer, we can help you. So those are like planetary aspects from planets that are helpful. Or are you stuck in the mansion with people who say, what, you want to make a musical CD? Well, I want to play cards all day and this guy wants to shoot guns, so you're not going to get help. And those are like planetary aspects which could distract you from your path. So the Rashi aspects show what kind of field is a planet growing in, which we cover in the Rashis and Signs course within the apprenticeship program. And the planetary aspects, which we've started looking at within the Grahas and Planets course, are showing you what is the interaction between the people in your life, or the planetary energy and consciousness within your life. And so we have this idea of a Jaimini principle, the Rashi aspects, with the Parashara planetary aspects. And it's not that you don't use them to, it's not that they're not being redundant. One is saying, this is what's going on in this area of life. The other is saying, this is who's there. So it doesn't make sense that you would want to separate those, because that gives you the full picture. And adding the Tajic aspects, well, that shows the moving together and separation of things within your life. So when we think about this, I'm just trying to encourage you to think about astrology, not deeming something traditional and fundamental and something avant-garde and inappropriate, but realizing that it may be that each system is just like a separate science, but leading you to the greater goal of understanding in more detail and more depth the chart that you're looking at. So Parashara and Jaimini astrology, when you understand the principles, it doesn't mean that you mix principles. It doesn't mean that I take ideas from Jaimini and try to force them into principles of Parashara. That's not what I'm saying at all. So I'm not taking one principle and trying to force it into another system. But what I'm saying is that they are doing separate functions, and that if you can understand how each of those functions work separately, and then you can put them into a deeper, more profound equation, well, then you get a deeper, more profound answer to the questions within a person's chart. And that's why when I started using these two systems together, as an equation to supplement the process, that's when I moved from, oh, you're going to get a promotion, to, I would say that to someone, you're going to get a promotion. And they would come back and say, oh, I got that promotion, but man, it's hell. Why didn't you tell me that? Or I would say, you're going to get divorced. And they would say, wow, you told me I was going to get divorced, but you didn't tell me that it was going to be the best thing in my life. So when you are looking at these two systems, what they allow you to do is to tell you kind of the what is going to happen, along with, in a sense, how are you going to feel about it. All right, so keep this in mind as you're considering Jaimini and Parashara techniques. And if you really want to learn Jaimini well, we do incorporate some of this into the apprenticeship program because it's essential. But to focus on Jaimini by itself, I would highly encourage you to explore Ernst Wilhelm's work on the sutras, Jaimini Upadesha Sutras. And I'll put a link to his classes at the bottom of this video so that you can explore them. I believe he has Jaimini 1, 2, and 3 courses, and they're wonderful courses. They can give you a lot of deep insight into understanding, unlocking those sutras, those principles within Jaimini. All right, so thank you very much for paying attention. Your thoughts are welcome. Realize that we may have differences of opinions on things, but maybe this will encourage some of you to test these things out so that you can see for yourself how it works or how it doesn't work. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to be your best guide in all things. All right, so be well.